Hello and welcome to the National Security Conversations. This is the 10th anniversary of the 26/11 terrorist attacks in Mumbai. 10 years since the terrorist attack on Mumbai. How well prepared are we to ensure that another 26/11 does not happen? It is one thing to say that we will retaliate, to say that hum muh tod jawab denge. But it's an entirely different matter to ensure that another terrorist attack does not happen, or we do not become an easy prey to the devious plans of terrorists from anywhere across the world. So the question is, are we prepared to defend ourselves against a repeat of 26/11? To discuss this and more, I have with me in the studio Commodore Uday Bhaskar. Uday Bhaskar is one of India's most thoughtful and well-regarded strategic thinkers. He is currently the director of the Society for Policy Studies based in New Delhi. Welcome to the National Security Conversation, Commodore Bhaskar. What are some of your reflections on 26/11 on the 10th anniversary of this horrible terrorist attack against India?
You know, I would say the very broad kind of reflections, if you will, on the 10th anniversary of the enormity of November 2008. I think a question that every citizen is asking, are we better prepared as a country to prevent the equivalent of another November 26, 2008? And as an analyst, as someone who studied this reasonably closely, I would say that on balance, India is better prepared in terms of the surveillance that it is now able to bring to bear, particularly in relation to the Arabian Sea, because if you remember the events of that particular incident 10 years ago, here was a boat that was able to slip into Indian waters undetected, and the perpetrators were able to land on the shores of Mumbai off Budhwar Park.
Right.
So immediately the tactical kind of inadequacy was that surveillance, that none of the agencies who were tasked with providing surveillance for the Indian coast were able to detect this particular vessel from coming in and allowing these people to land and carry out the horrific attack that they did. So if you look back, I would say that in the last 10 years, there has been an enhancement of surveillance capability.
Commodore Bhaskar, before we come to the specifics, do you think there is too much premium that is put on what happened in 2008 and who did and how they did it, rather than say discussions on how we can prevent another 26/11? As a nation, what are we putting more premium on what happened or on what should not happen in future?
Well, I think there is a certain emotive association with 26/11 because the kind of terror attack that India was subjected to at that time remains unprecedented. If you look at the scale of 26/11, it was literally saying that the whole city of Mumbai, large sections of it were held hostage. Now that is an enormous kind of symbolism about India's vulnerability, that your financial capital, Mumbai is the happening place, that the entire Indian security apparatus was unable to protect, to defend for 3 days. So I think to that extent, it will remain a scar on the Indian collective. But I do think that we could have had more objective kind of discussions and some serious policy related kind of decisions about improving the security metrics, and that is where I think I would say again as an analyst that we could have done better. And what we have done with the Coast Guard is perhaps one success story. But if you go down the chain to the coastal police, because if you look at the grid as it were in terms of India's security tasking, you have the Indian Navy right on top, mainly because it has the kind of equipment and capacity that it does to be out there in well beyond India's exclusive economic zone. That's 200 kilometers nautical miles. Then you have the Coast Guard and then you have the local police. So this is an interesting point, Happy Mon, actually, that if you look at 9/11, 10 years later, we had an incident in the Andaman Nicobar,
Right,
where John Allen Chow, the US tourist, was able to reach a forbidden island.
How did that happen?
Exactly. So what it does point to is again a breach, that our surveillance was not in place, not adequate. So my point, and I said this in public elsewhere, that in a way John Allen Chow in the North Sentinel Island is a reality check, that we were unable to prevent one foreign national from making a third or fourth visit, which means all the filters that are in place, including the monitoring of foreign nationals, how they come, how they go, were again inadequate, or if reports are to be believed, that he was able to get local assistance to slip through the various cordons, which means corruption, money changing, whatever it is.
If he could do it, anybody could do it.
So, I think these are the points we need to ponder over.
Commodore Bhaskar, talking about coastal security, India has 7,516 kilometer long coastline, and it remains one of India's major weak spots. In fact, in April 2017, the Standing Committee in the Parliament on Home stated that coastal security is an important challenge the country is facing on the external front. Funds are being provided to the states for maritime policing and coastal security, but several states have failed to spend the funds fully, while projects under coastal security scheme are being delayed implementation. In other words, coordinating coastal security among 9 states is not an easy task. So, do you think maritime boundary should be treated as one unit and one agency should be tasked with the responsibility of coordinating intelligence and action in order to ensure that maritime security is taken care of?
Well, again, I would say that there is a case, I think, for us to have one single point nodal agency that would pull together all the strands. Because at the last count that I remember doing a little homework on this, we had 19 separate departments and ministries to the Government of India, apart from state agencies and other specialized kind of units, including the Department of Lighthouses, for instance, which have different parts of this entire octopus, if you will. Now, that is not the best management approach. So, I think there is a case, as many other countries have done. We often talk about the example of France, where you have a single point entity that provides a national maritime umbrella. Now, I am not suggesting that we have to emulate France and the French example, but except to make the conceptual point that the existing arrangement of the management of India's seas and oceans is inadequate. And because of this divided responsibility, we are trying to improve the grid. For instance, now the Indian Coast Guard has been designated as the nodal agency for coastal security, but at the same time the 9 coastal states, and we also have to remember the union territories. Because I think one of India's biggest problems when it comes to our understanding of the maritime security domain is that our entire thinking as a people, and I am taking the liberty of saying this on your show, we have been conditioned to think along a land grid. So, we talk about Kashmir to Kanyakumari.
It's continental thinking.
Absolutely. Whereas, the Indian geography should actually accurately say Kashmir to Kanyakumari, yes, but also Andaman Nicobar to Lakshadweep Minicoy. That would give you the accurate geography of India and instill a certain maritime empathy. So, these 9 coastal states and the 4 union territories, of which the most recent example of the breach is John Allen Chow in the Andaman Nicobar Islands, a union territory that has to be administered by various agencies. So, I think the coastal states have to become more committed stakeholders in coastal security, because it is too difficult for us to tell the coastal states to give up, because this is primarily a policing function, and we know how sensitive states are about surrendering any aspect of the police function. As you know very well, repeatedly every chief minister has pointed out that whenever the center has tried to make an initiative, they get very sensitive and they say police is a state subject, meaning it is under state jurisdiction. Chief ministers want to have the control. So, we have to proceed slowly, but make the coastal state, and a very good example is Tamil Nadu. Since November 2008, all the reforms that have been put into place, Tamil Nadu and Andhra come up fairly high. Maharashtra is peculiar because of Mumbai itself and the various challenges there. But I think there is a case for encouraging coastal states, especially where the incidence or the probability of any kind of illegal activity peaking at terrorism is on the radar. We should encourage them to step up.
We should encourage them. How do we do that? I think that's the crucial question. I think one way of doing that is probably to tell the people that coastal security is important for their livelihood, coastal security is important for their existence, not just from a terrorist attack point of view, but in several ways. So, as a Navy officer, how do you sort of look at in sort of getting this message across to people on the ground in various states? Because they have not been told this before. They have been told that this is go about your daily business without worrying about
I must
anything.
share this interesting conversation that I had once in the immediate aftermath of 2008, and we had gone to Mumbai and some of the coastal police stations that had been set up. And we were also talking to the local, fishermen, local people about, what are the new things that have happened. For instance, there was talk about having every fishing vessel with the equivalent of a chip or some kind of an identification system, so that there would be an automatic reporting mechanism, the AIS equivalent. And I remember this slightly elderly man in one of the villages outside of Bombay in that Versova area saying कि in Hindi he was sort of explaining कि साहब अभी तक तो हम सबको ये लोग स्मगलर मानते थे, meaning that there is a traditional linkage which I think Hindi cinema has also accentuated, that the entire fishing community of India is seen to be hand in glove.
Bootleggers.
Yeah, exactly. The illegal activity, either liquor or gold or whatever. So I think we need a change of mindset. And as has often been said, your first level of the eyes and ears should be the local community. Now I am aware that the Indian Coast Guard is making some efforts along with the coastal police. Some states have had a better success rate, but I think this is a very important area that you must make the local people aware and involve them and say that it is your security and it is the entire district or region or village or wherever you are that is going to pay a heavy price in the event there is a breach. So I think this is going to be an ongoing process, but I am optimistic on this because I think technology and the cell phone have now allowed various avenues of communication. How we do it remains to be seen, but you can see the change already taking place.
Coastal police stations, now how do they contribute?
Well, let me give you an example going back to November 2008. The terrorists who had come, Kasab included, had landed near Budhwar Park. Right. And if you know the geography of that part of Bombay, this is where the railways has their residential area. It is under the broader jurisdiction of the Cuff Parade police station. So it's a case of saying that you land, there's a little fishing village over there, you cross the road and you are in Budhwar Park, which is where the railway officers have their residential accommodation. You walk barely half a kilometer and you can access Kolaba Causeway, the Gateway of India and the Taj Hotel and so on. Now, if you go back to 2008, this entire area was under the jurisdiction of the Cuff Parade police station, which has its own, law and order kind of tasking and, whether it's traffic or petty thievery or criminality, whatever. So they did not have the resources to be able to monitor, this part of the sea face as it were. Whatever be the surveillance and reporting mechanisms were found to be inadequate. So my point is that the local police station needs to be given much higher levels of surveillance capability using today's technology, so that any movement that would be deemed to be suspect is automatically picked up. And my point is that today you have technology that allows you to map the entire coastal seas, the oceans, depending on what priority you accord to it. So when technology is available, I think we have to find ways of harnessing it. And the concept of the coastal police station actually is a post 2008 kind of development, meaning that the review that was carried out came to the conclusion that we do not have the kind of coastal policing that we need. So the government, central government promptly sanctioned, and I think last count they had approved in 2 phases, 113 additional coastal police stations.
So these police stations will be doing different kind of work, or?
Well, they would actually pick up the surveillance from where the Coast Guard leaves off. So as I said, the Indian Navy is out there in the ocean. Yeah. As you enter the exclusive economic zone from 200 nautical miles towards the shore, the Coast Guard has a broad footprint along with the Navy. We have coastal radars also. As you move from 12 kilometers towards the coast, this is called the territorial water. And as you come closer to 3 kilometers, you have certain revenue and various other port kind of security that has to be maintained. The local police has that particular responsibility.
The BSF also comes into play. So I thought in places like Gujarat, the BSF has a role to play.
That's largely because of the nature of the geography there. As you know, the BSF looks after that part of the security as far as the India-Pakistan border is concerned. It tapers off into the Sir Creek. Right. So the BSF has a kind of distinctive role over there, but that, as I said, is standalone only for that particular sector. Otherwise, the primary responsibility of coastal security is on these 3 agencies: the Indian Navy, the Indian Coast Guard and the 9 coastal states plus 4 union territories, and whatever be the police kind of resources they are able to bring to bear, which is actually one of the weakest areas. Because as you know, most state police, I keep saying constantly, this is the politics of security, that India's security is often, I would say, degraded because of political compulsions. And a prime example is talk to any DIG in a state. Most of their primary tasking is for quote unquote VIP security.
Right.
So, in a country where the police population ratio is not very robust, if you do not have trained personnel who can carry out coastal policing, which is very different from a beat constable who is doing duties within the municipality or the small town or the big city, you need somebody for a start who can swim, who understands a little bit about the sea, who can carry out surveillance and manage a boat.
So the coastal police stations would add another layer to this graduated understanding of security.
It is the primary layer.
So you have the police stations, you have the coastal
Coast
police
Guard
stations, the
and-
Coast Guard, the Navy. So
that would be the ladder in which we are looking at, and all of this has to be seamless and it has to move in real time. If it doesn't, you will have John Allen Chow.
right. Commodore Bhaskar, you talked about the absence of institutional coordination and collaboration among various agencies. There has been a lot of talk about setting up what is called the National Counter-Terrorism Center, or NCTC. The Cabinet Committee on Security approved it in 2012. The chief ministers of some states have been raising concerns about it, saying that it sort of infringes on the federal structure of the country. How do you see the NCTC, the utility of the NCTC as a single, unified and premier counter-terrorism agency? Is that, does that really infringe on the federal structure of the
I would say
country?
there is a case to have the equivalent of a national grid that would be looking at terrorism. Much of this, the preventive work that we are talking about, is based on information.
That's right.
It's a very kind of, I would say the requirement one can conceptualize to say that if you want to deal with terrorism, and our standard association is, if you say terrorism in India, we think of J&K. Whereas the reality is that today it is possible to have this kind of a challenge in any part of India. It could be Kerala, it could be J&K, it could be the Northeast or elsewhere. So, given the kind of mobility and connectivity that we now have in 2018, every major country that is trying to deal with this, for instance, the United States post 9/11, Spain after they went to the attack through their attack in Madrid, the UK and London, France and Paris, most of them have created what could be called as a national database, particularly for anybody who has been identified with any activity that could be deemed to be on the cusp of terrorist related. Unfortunately, in India today, while everyone agrees that we need that kind of a database, especially since we are 1.2 billion people, I am not suggesting that all 1.2 get into the computer. We already have the Aadhaar and whatever we are doing with that. But those who are deemed to be acting in a manner that is detrimental to national security should be part of a national database. This should be available at the click of a mouse to any police station in India. That would be your holy grail in terms of what I would call as the national database. From that you can derive the various strands as to what kind of focus should be maintained, because no country can maintain the same level of surveillance 24/7 over 1.2 billion citizens if it is believed that they need to be kept under watch for any activity that could be detrimental to national security. But you can have layers and layers and bring the capability there. So that is a bit like saying, Happy Mon Jacob, you have your name. Whether you click the computer in Srinagar or you click it in Kochi, your information should come up. There might be 500 people with the same name. So we should be able to disaggregate, and all of this technology allows. So my point is that we are not invested in that with the kind of resolve that we need because of this constant center state sensitivities.
But Commodore Bhaskar, you are talking about two things. One is the issue of NCTC, the other is the issue of NatGrid. So we have both these institutions sort of trying to sort of come into existence in some way or the other. On the NCTC question, there is a pushback from the states. So you are saying that let that be the case. Let's focus on a grid, national grid, which is a national grid. On the national grid, very interestingly, in April 2017, the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Home Affairs had this to say. When the committee sought to know the reasons for delayed implementation of NatGrid, the Home Secretary replied that there were several challenges in the implementation of the project. By the time these challenges were overcome and the technology implementation plan was ready, the existing technology had become outdated and the new technology was available, due to which technology implementation had to be revised.
But I don't think that's acceptable, frankly, meaning this is correct. That standing committee had made this observation. I recall this. But this is my point, that whether we talk about the NCTC or we talk about the NAT grid, it's all got entangled in the politics of India, which is unfortunate because in many ways I think national security is being compromised because of security compulsions, and this is a very undesirable state of affairs. Whether we talk about the Bofors syndrome, which has now become the Rafale syndrome, or you talk about the fact that India is unable to swiftly even import major military equipment because of this constant mudslinging between the major political parties, and you talk about the whole intelligence apparatus of India, for instance. There are various, I would say, national capacities that are not being brought to speed or up to the levels that we desire, which I would consider optimum, mainly because of a certain political dynamic. So, this is what I mean by saying that we need a review and a revamp of national intelligence, which by the way is not new. It hasn't come about because of Mumbai 2008. Yeah. If you recall, after the Kargil war in 1999, when Mr. Vajpayee was our Prime Minister, there was a review committee which had very eminent people led by the late Mr. K. Subramaniam, and that report is part of it is in the public domain. One of the areas that was identified for very thorough overall was national intelligence, because our existing agencies, whether we talk about the RAW, the IB, the CBI, need to be brought up to what I would call as the contemporary requirements. And we still seem to have an approach or an attitude where the IPS as a cadre, the Indian Police Service, is seen to be, tasked with every aspect of policing and intelligence and paramilitary. I mean, whether it's the BSF, the CRPF, CISF. Yes. My point is that this is not tenable. Today in 2018, you need specialists. You need INT specialists. You can look at the example of any country to see how they have moved ahead. I mean, a very simple thing like today technology and intelligence. The kind of advances that have been made in cyber, for instance, and what cyber can and cannot do in terms of intelligence protection is mind-boggling at one level. So, you need people who have really been marinated in cyber. It doesn't come easily to the average IPS officer who is also, part of this political, shall we say, musical chairs.
And talking about IPS officers, the NAT grid is headed by an IPS officer. The NAT grid, the fact that the NAT grid has not come into existence or is not in its proper shape and form is because of incompetence. But NCTC is more an example of politicization of national security in many ways, because the states are pushing back, citing concerns about federalism, etc., etc. So just to be clear, where do you stand on that? What the states are saying has a certain sort of point here. What they are saying is basically in the age of such politicization, you see how CBI is a caged parrot today. The central government can use these agencies, especially an agency that with so much power like the NCTC can be used against states and state leaders. So they are concerned about. So there's a genuine concern from the states. Where do you stand on this particular issue?
See, first of all, I want to make this observation. My own reading, having interacted with our IPS officers and people from the other services over the years, we have some very competent officers,
no doubt,
in the police cadre, and they have a very difficult responsibility. And I think what they do sometimes is not adequately appreciated, because the kind of political, shall we say, pressures they are subjected to is quite extraordinary at one level. There are all kinds of, shall we say, pressures and humiliation that police officers who do not comply are subjected to. One has some sense of that. I think our real challenge is that national security in India does not get the kind of political attention it deserves. And here I am talking both about the rigor of that political attention and the integrity of the political establishment when it comes to national security. And Kargil, I would say, is the example where, while there was a consensus in the Vajpayee government that we needed to have certain changes, structural changes, and 4 GOMs were set up headed by very senior ministers at that time, nothing has changed in a significant way on the ground. So, India is a bit like the Trishanku, saying that we are suspended. We know that we have to make the changes, but we have not been able to do it. And as a result, many of the important kind of rewiring that you need as far as national security is concerned, and this is not just the police. Today national security, whether we talk about the external or the internal security, is overlapping. So, gone are those days where you can say that the Indian military looked after external security and the Indian police and the central police organizations looked after internal security. That's not valid. So everybody agrees with this particular, shall we say, observation or tenet, but yet we have this anomalous situation where if you talk about national security, the three service chiefs, the Army, Navy, Air Force, are not even mentioned in the rules of business. So we have a minister and a bureaucrat, the defense secretary, who are responsible for national security in the defense domain. In the relation to the home or the internal security, the responsibility is divided between the center and the states. And again, there is a lot of anxiety in states that the center misuses.
Absolutely.
Particularly, I think the highest price we are paying is in relation to terrorism. Today, domestic terrorism, whether it's in J&K or the Northeast or any other part of
Kerala
India,
for that matter,
has become a handmaiden of domestic politics. Particularly, I think the kind of, shall we say, ideological divide that we are now seeing in India, where there is a majoritarian sentiment, which is very detrimental, I think, to the fabric of internal security in the country, is a classic example. And most major cases, whether we talk about Mumbai attack in 1993 or Gujarat, investigations that have taken place would testify to this overlap or the muddying of the waters when it comes to center, state and the investigative kind of processes.
Commodore Bhaskar, you mentioned in passing about the politics of intelligence. Can you elaborate a little more on that? What do you mean by that?
See, what I mean by that is that today the entire intelligence capacity of this country is very opaque. And I am starting with Pandit Nehru's time to where we are now. So, under Pandit Nehru, there was an intelligence czar whom the Prime Minister believed in implicitly, and this kind of tradition went down. We had Mrs. Indira Gandhi as Prime Minister. Similarly, the intelligence czar or the chief at that time reported directly to the PM, and there was a certain culture that was in a way encouraged. Clearly, this was not acceptable. Some attempts were made, particularly after 2008, if you remember, when they tried to rewire the system. And Dr. Manmohan Singh was our Prime Minister, and there were two important changes that were effected. Mr. Shivraj Patil, as the Home Minister, was asked to step down, and Mr. Narayanan, who was the National Security Advisor at that time, was also moved to another job. And we said that there would be a revamp, and one of the first things that the then Home Minister, who was appointed, Mr. Chidambaram, did was to say that we need the intelligence agencies to report to the Home Minister and not to the PMO, which is the direct kind of control that they were exercising through the NSA. So I do recall that there were some very, very intense discussions, because obviously the status quo suited certain, shall we say, structures within the system. But what has happened from then to now in the last 10 years is that the scrutiny of the intelligence agencies and the legislative oversight, meaning that in any democracy, intelligence agencies must also be regulated and monitored so that they are staying within the framework of normative governance. I do recall that in UPA 2, if I remember right, Mr. Manish Tiwari had tried to introduce an individual bill at that time to try and bring about these kind of modest, I would say, initiatives, but it did not go very far. So, as a result, the average citizen knows very little about how the intelligence agencies are working, except what is reported in the media. Now, we are also aware that we are living at a time when everything that is reported in the media may not be accurate, particularly in relation to what we have seen. The CBI is a very classic example. So, as a citizen and as a security analyst, my observation is that whether you talk about state intelligence, which is collected by the SIBs, or we talk about the central agencies and what they are collecting, the primary kind of focus seems to be on political intelligence. Most intelligence agencies get into overdrive in the run up to an election. Will this party win, will that party win, what is the buzz on the ground, etc., etc. For a long time, Indian intelligence agencies were focusing on left wing activities within India. I mean, Kerala is a good example, West Bengal is a good example. In the Nehru, Indira Gandhi years, a lot of time was spent on the RSS.
Today we are talking about
it's all the domestic,
urban Maoists,
exactly.
Urban Naxals.
So these are the kind of domestic compulsions which are driven by politics. They suck up the oxygen of the agencies, and this is the culture and the ecosystem that then gets nurtured. My very strong exhortation in public is to say that we need a blue ribbon panel devoid of any political overhang that would actually review our intelligence agencies in 2018 build on what has already been put together in previous reports, whether it is the Subramaniam Kargil Committee report or the intelligence agencies have done some internal reviews, and bring it up to speed. And many senior professionals within the intelligence agencies have said the same thing. I mean, I can share this name on television, alas, he is no more with us. We had the late Mr. B. Raman. Yes. Outstanding intelligence professional, everybody acknowledged his professional competence. He had some, I would say, very kind of informed views. And I recall we discussed this post 2008 at that time, and he's written about this in the public domain, so it's not as if it's not there, where he has said the time has now come for deep specialization even within the agencies, and also the management of the cadre needs a certain revamp.
In fact, not just the cadre, Commodore Bhaskar, the Parliamentary Standing Committee, I am going on with the Parliamentary Standing Committees because they are pretty critical of what is happening on Home Affairs, said in March this year that while there are agencies like the NIA, the IB, Multi-Agency Center, the NSG and some in the pipeline like NatGrid, they are cumulatively capable of addressing the menace. There is no single unified authority to coordinate the operations of these agencies and ensure a quick response in times of crisis like the 26/11 attack. That's a very stinging argument that the parliamentary committee is making. Why is that there is no appetite within the government for creating such coordinating mechanisms?
Well, again,
who is against the reforms?
You know, it's a sad thing to say, but clearly for the political establishment in India, national security does not get the importance it deserves, except when you have a Mumbai, when there are 2 days of agonizing and we have some very emotional kind of, shall we say, speeches in parliament. But that hard work that is required, I mean, it's one of those very sad things again to say in public. For 20-25 years, I've been looking at debates in parliament, you know, when they are published. National security gets very little sustained attention. The defense budget of India, with which I'm more familiar, gets passed in about 2.5 minutes, very often without adequate quorum. And we are talking about amounts that are $40 to $50 billion at any given time. So I think this is a reflection that for the largest democracy in the world, the political establishment does not seem to find national security to be as important an issue for deliberation and action. I mean, Parliament must legislate. Parliament must bring laws up to speed. Across the board, we have not equipped ourselves both with the appropriate legislation and then ensure that your agencies have the kind of capability that is required to maintain that minimum level of national security that you need to prevent a Mumbai, to prevent a North Sentinel Island.
Commodore Bhaskar, what is very interesting about the last 30 minutes of discussion is that we have been looking at national security using a domestic prism, and we have not been really trying to put blame on the others. Pakistan is doing it, maybe Pakistan is doing things, but we have been trying to look at what is happening internally, how things can be set right here. But having said that, I think it is important to look at the neighborhood, and that's my last question. How do you sort of evaluate the Pakistani responses to India on the question of 26/11 trials in particular, and on the question of terrorism in general?
Well, inadequate. Pakistan's response for the last 10 years, disappointing, but not surprising. Meaning that if you talk about India's, I think, very distinctive security challenge, there is no country in the world that has this kind of a security environment wherein you have the equivalent of a sister state that was born in August 1947, which has got this kind of embedded, shall we say, hostility to the idea of India. And therefore, I say this very unambiguously that from January 1990 onwards, India has been dealing with this proxy war, which to a large extent is being supported or funded by Pakistan and its own agencies, the deep state, and now there are some autonomous actors also. And the greater complexity for India is that Pakistan is receiving diplomatic and political support from China, particularly say in the United Nations Security Council. So 10 years after Mumbai's attack in November 2008, one of the, I think, developments that has not received adequate attention in India because we were caught up with other things is that the LET as an organization has become more potent, more credible and more acceptable within Pakistan's domestic calculus than what it was in November 2008.
So you then say that it is probably easier for us to create systems within India and carry out the necessary national security reforms rather than trying to change Pakistan's attitude
I think
towards
if we
India.
talk about priorities, we must look inwards and improve our capabilities, because your challenges do not necessarily always have to come from Pakistan. John Allen Chow is a good example of yet another, shall we say, challenge to the way in which India's sovereignty and security can be threatened. And if you look at the next 10 years, it's very unlikely that Bombay will be repeated. We haven't even spoken about drones, technology, cyber. And my anticipation is that at some point, we will move from cyber and space to spectrum. What if a non-state entity or a terrorist, I am sure today's younger generation will know what we are talking about, if somebody acquires the ability of spectrum denial, no more WhatsApp, no more Instagram, we'll all be suspended. I'm just kidding.
No, it has implications for national security.
These are serious issues. The technology is going to empower the terrorist, and it's not just that undetected boat coming from Karachi. Today, the terrorist can be enabled in any which way, or the non-state entity can be enabled in any which way, and I'm just pointing to some technological possibilities from the drone to spectrum denial.
Commodore Bhaskar, wonderful talking to you.
Thank you.
To receive instant updates on all videos from The Wire, click the subscribe button and hit the bell icon. Pay to support independent journalism. Click the link in the description and choose the amount you want to pay.